All right, so someone sent us like a whole stack of physiology MCQs about the respiratory system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so get ready to like dive deep into breathing.
I am so ready for this.
Okay, so like I was looking through these questions, right? And I
Yeah.
suddenly realized like, wow, breathing, it's like way more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, it's really interesting how something we kind of take for granted every second of the day
Yeah,
actually is like this amazingly complex system.
totally. And these MCQs are really making me think about all the stuff I just never even considered before.
Right.
Like all the different lung volumes and the muscles and like even conditions I had literally never heard of.
It's true. Those lung volume questions are a great place to start
Yeah.
because understanding things like tidal volume and residual volume,
Mhm.
those are like the keys to really getting how we breathe.
Okay, so like tidal volume, residual volume, what are those?
Well, think about it this way. Every time you breathe in and out,
Hmm.
that amount of air you're moving, that's your tidal volume.
Okay, so like
Oh,
my regular breath.
exactly.
Got it.
Now, residual volume, that's like the air that's always in your lungs, even after you exhale as hard as you can.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It's like about 1,500 milliliters of air just hanging out in there.
Huh, I had no idea. So even when I like breathe out and try to empty my lungs, there's still air in there.
You got it. Your lungs never completely empty. It's
Yeah.
like a built-in reserve system.
Wow, that's wild. And makes sense. Like, I guess if your lungs completely emptied, every time you breathed out, they might like collapse or something.
Exactly. That residual volume helps keep them inflated and ensures there's always some gas exchange happening.
Speaking of gas exchange, that's another thing that's blowing my mind. Like, it's one thing to breathe in oxygen,
Right.
but then what happens to it?
Well, that's where those tiny air sacs in your lungs, the alveoli, come in.
Alveoli. I've definitely heard that word before.
They're like the superstars of gas exchange.
Mm.
That's where the oxygen from the air you breathe in actually crosses over into your bloodstream.
Okay, so it's like they're tiny but mighty.
Totally. And they rely on this amazing molecule called hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin, isn't that what makes blood red?
It is. Hemoglobin is this incredible protein that's found inside your red blood cells. And its superpower is its ability to bind to oxygen.
So it's like the oxygen transporter.
Exactly. It's like a little tiny Uber for oxygen molecules, picking them up from your lungs and delivering them to all your cells.
Okay, that makes sense. But I have a question. One of these MCQs was asking, like, why we need hemoglobin if oxygen can just dissolve directly into our blood.
That's a great question. You see, some oxygen does dissolve in the blood,
Right.
but it's not nearly enough to keep us going. We're talking about a tiny amount compared to what we need.
So we need those hemoglobin Ubers to pick up the slack.
Exactly. Hemoglobin can carry way more oxygen than could ever dissolve in your blood alone.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about efficiency.
Wow. So it's like our bodies have evolved this really smart system to make sure we're getting enough oxygen.
Absolutely.
Hey.
And it all comes down to this amazing relationship between oxygen and hemoglobin.
This is so cool. Okay, so we've got the oxygen getting into our blood, but how does it actually get moved around our bodies?
Well, I think it's time we talk about the diaphragm.
The diaphragm.
Right?
Isn't that like the main muscle involved in breathing?
It's the star of the show.
Mm.
This dome-shaped muscle sits right under your lungs, and every time you take a breath, it contracts and relaxes, basically acting like a pump.
Okay, so like when it contracts, it pulls down, creating more space in your chest.
Exactly. And that allows your lungs to expand, drawing in air.
And then when it relaxes, it pushes the air back out.
You got it.
Hmm.
It's a beautifully simple yet effective system.
Okay, but how does the diaphragm know when to contract and relax? Is it like something we consciously control?
Well, we can consciously control it to some extent, like when we take a deep breath.
Right.
But for the most part, it's all thanks to your nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, this nerve called the phrenic nerve.
The phrenic nerve. That rings a bell. Didn't one of those MCQs mention something about it coming from the C3, C5 vertebrae?
You're good. That's right. The phrenic nerve originates from those cervical vertebrae in your neck.
Okay, so our breathing is controlled by nerves in our neck. That's wild.
It is. Your brain sends signals down your spinal cord, out those nerves, and straight to your diaphragm, telling it when to contract and relax.
So it's like this whole chain of command happening with every breath.
Exactly. And it's happening constantly without you even having to think about it.
Hmm.
Pretty amazing, huh?
That is pretty amazing. It makes me wonder, though, what happens when something goes wrong in that chain of command? Like, what if the signals get messed up?
Well, that's when you start seeing some of those conditions those MCQs mentioned, like hypoxia or even emphysema.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about those. What exactly is hypoxia? It sounds kind of scary.
It can be. Hypoxia basically means your body's tissues aren't getting enough oxygen.
And that's bad, right? Because we were just talking about how important oxygen is.
Exactly. Without enough oxygen, your cells can't function properly.
So it's like they're being starved of air.
In a way, yeah. See, like if you were trying to run a marathon, but you couldn't get enough air into your lungs, your body would start to shut down.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about emphysema? That one sounds kind of familiar. Isn't that related to smoking?
It often is. Emphysema is a lung disease that damages those tiny air sacs, the alveoli we were talking about.
The alveoli, right, the gas exchange superstars.
Exactly. Well, in emphysema, those air sacs become damaged and lose their elasticity. So it's like trying to blow up a balloon that's already full of holes.
Oh, no.
It becomes really hard to breathe because your lungs can't inflate and deflate properly.
Wow. Okay, these conditions are really making me think twice about taking breathing for granted.
They should. We don't always realize how important our lungs are until something goes wrong.
So true. And these MCQs, they're like really highlighting all the things that can go wrong.
They are,
Yeah.
but they're also highlighting the amazing resilience of the respiratory system.
Okay, so we've talked about the diaphragm, the phrenic nerve, even some of the things that can go wrong with breathing. But there's still so much to cover.
There is so much. We haven't even touched on the brain's role in all of this.
Oh, right, because it's not all automatic, right? Like we can consciously control our breathing too.
Exactly. So how does that work? How do we override those automatic breathing centers in our brainstem?
And what about all those other systems that are connected to our respiratory system? Like I'm thinking about the circulatory system, the heart, all that good stuff.
So many connections. It's like a giant web.
Yeah.
And we're just starting to untangle it.
I know, right? This is way more interesting than I ever imagined. I'm already looking forward to the next deep dive on this topic.
Me too. We're just getting started.
Okay, so hypoxia, right? It's like, it sounds kind of intense.
Yeah, it's not exactly a walk in the park. Hypoxia basically means your body's not getting enough oxygen where it needs to go.
And like every cell needs oxygen, right?
Pretty much.
Hmm.
Think of it like this. Your cells are like those little gas-guzzling sports cars.
Okay.
They need that premium fuel to run. And oxygen, that's their premium fuel. Hypoxia is like running those cars on fumes.
So like eventually they just stop working.
Exactly. Things start to break down, and if it goes on long enough, well, you can have some serious damage.
Not good. So hypoxia is like a cellular fuel crisis.
Basically.
Okay. And then there's emphysema. That's another one that sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah, emphysema, that's a big one. It's all about damage to those alveoli we were talking about.
Right. The little air sacs.
Exactly. They're usually nice and stretchy, like tiny balloons, inflating and deflating with every breath. But with emphysema, they lose that elasticity, and they can even break down.
So they can't do their job as well.
Exactly. It's like trying to breathe through a sponge that's lost its sponginess.
So it makes breathing way harder.
Exactly. You can imagine how exhausting that would be for your body constantly struggling to get enough air.
Totally. These conditions are really making me grateful for my healthy lungs.
Right. It's easy to take them for granted.
They're like the unsung heroes of our bodies.
For sure. Speaking of things that can go wrong with our lungs, you know what else came up in these MCQs?
What's that?
Pneumothorax.
Pneumo what now?
Pneumothorax. It's basically when air gets trapped in the space between your lung and your chest wall.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's more common than you might think.
Yeah.
And it can be caused by like an injury or even just happen spontaneously sometimes.
Spontaneously. So you could just be walking down the street and suddenly...
It's rare, but it can happen.
Yeah.
It's more likely if you have certain risk factors, like if you're tall and thin or have a family history of it.
Wow. So it's like your lung could partially collapse out of nowhere.
In a way, yeah. It's like if you had a balloon and suddenly it got a hole in it and started deflating.
Okay, that does not sound like a good time.
It's not fun. That's where it's important to know the signs and symptoms so you can get help right away.
Okay. So we've talked about hypoxia, emphysema, pneumothorax. It's like a whole crash course in respiratory disasters.
Well, every good superhero needs a good villain or two, right?
Yeah. True. But on a serious note, it's actually really helpful to learn about these conditions.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. The more we know about how things can go wrong, the better equipped we are to take care of ourselves.
I totally agree. And speaking of taking care of ourselves, I think it's time we talked about the brain's role in all of this.
Oh, yeah. Because it's not just our lungs doing all the work, right?
Not at all. It's a team effort.
Yeah.
And your brain is like the head coach calling the plays.
Okay, so how does that work? Like, tell me everything.
Right. So deep down in your brainstem, there are these areas called the medulla oblongata and the pons.
The medulla oblongata and the pons?
Yeah, they sound kind of intimidating.
A little bit.
But trust me, they're our friends. These guys, they're like the unsung heroes of breathing. They control the rate and depth of your breathing without you even having to think about it.
So they're like the automatic breathing control center?
Exactly. They're constantly monitoring your blood for things like carbon dioxide levels.
Okay.
And if they sense something's off, Like if your CO2 is too high, they send out signals to your respiratory muscles, telling them to work harder.
So that's why we breathe faster when we exercise.
Exactly. Your body's working hard, producing more CO2, and your brain's like, time to step it up, team lungs.
That is so cool. But what about when we consciously control our breathing? Like when we take a deep breath or hold our breath?
Ah, good question.
Yeah.
That's where things get even more interesting. You see, even though we have these automatic breathing centers, we can override them to a certain extent using our higher brain functions.
So we have like a manual override switch.
Exactly. You decide you want to take a deep breath, your cerebral cortex, the thinking part of your brain, steps in and sends out a special memo.
A memo to the medulla oblongata.
Exactly. It's like, hey, team, take a break from the usual routine. We're going off script for a minute.
I love that. So it's like we have both automatic and manual controls for our breathing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that interplay between the two is what allows us to do things like sing talk, even hold our breath for a short period of time.
Wow. The more we learn about breathing, the more amazing it seems.
Yeah.
It's like this whole hidden world inside us.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we're just starting to scratch the surface.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Like we've talked about lung volumes and gas exchange and those crazy conditions like pneumothorax.
Right? It's like we've taken a journey through the entire respiratory system.
Totally. And I gotta say, I'm really starting to appreciate how complex and interconnected it all is.
It really is. It's not just a bunch of isolated parts. It's like a well-oiled machine where everything works together.
Exactly. And speaking of working together, I'm realizing that our respiratory system, it doesn't just exist in isolation, right? Not at all. It's constantly interacting with all the other systems in our bodies. Like take the circulatory system, for example.
Okay, yeah. The heart and all that.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Your lungs are like the oxygen supply depot, and your heart is like the delivery truck.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So your lungs, they fill up the truck with oxygen, and the heart drives that oxygen all over the body to every single cell.
And we were talking about hemoglobin before, right? That's like the delivery guy riding in the truck, making sure the oxygen gets where it needs to go.
Exactly, hemoglobin.
Yeah.
The ultimate oxygen chauffeur. It's a well-coordinated delivery service happening inside of us. That's amazing. And it makes you realize, like, breathing, it's not just about getting air into our lungs.
Not at all. It's about supplying our entire bodies with the fuel they need to survive.
Wow. And to think we do all of this without even realizing it?
Right. It's like our bodies are these amazing machines that just keep chugging along.
They really are.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the circulatory system, but what about some of the other systems that interact with our respiratory system? Are there any other big ones we should touch on?
Well, one that comes to mind is the nervous system.
Okay, the nervous system. We talked about that a little bit before with the phrenic nerve.
Right. The phrenic nerve is like the direct line of communication between your brain and your diaphragm.
Right. So our brain is telling our diaphragm when to contract and relax.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's more than just that. Your brain is also constantly monitoring your blood for things like oxygen and carbon dioxide levels.
Okay. And why is that important?
Well, let's say you're exercising really hard.
Okay.
Your body's using up more oxygen and producing more carbon dioxide, right?
Makes sense.
Well, your brain senses those changes in your blood.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, time to ramp up the breathing.
So that's why we breathe faster when we work out.
Exactly. It's your brain's way of making sure your body is getting the oxygen it needs and getting rid of that extra CO2.
That is so cool. So it's like our brain is the ultimate control center for our breathing.
Exactly. And it's doing all of this behind the scenes without us even having to think about it. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is. And I think it's a good reminder that our bodies are capable of some pretty amazing things.
They really are. And the more we learn about how they work, the more we can appreciate just how incredible they are.
I totally agree. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the ins and outs of breathing, from those tiny alveoli to the powerful diaphragm and everything in between.
It's been quite a journey through the respiratory system.
It really has. And I think we've all learned a lot about this vital system that keeps us going.
Absolutely. So next time you take a breath, take a moment to appreciate all the amazing things that are happening inside your body.
I know, I will. And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains engaged and those questions coming.
Until next time, happy breathing, everyone.